Alex Poatan and Israel Adesanya's rivalry is almost a decade long. They fought more than 3 times in 2 different sports. In the encounters between them we witnessed super exciting fights, epic comebacks, and brutal knockouts for both sides. They both have great charisma and a large legion of fans. Both Pereira and Adesanya are legends in the world of fighting, the Nigerian for being one of the most dominant champions in recent UFC history, with 5 belt defenses, and he is one of the biggest stars MMA has ever had in its history, and the Brazilian for being the first double champion in Glory Kickboxing, and also for becoming the 9th fighter to be champion of 2 divisions in the UFC. Despite being 3-1 for the Brazilian on the scoreboard, all of Pereira's victories over Adesanya were extremely difficult victories, and the victory that Izzy has over the Brazilian was a very difficult one too. Every time these 2 striking legends step into the ring or octagon to face each other, it is certain that there will be a thrilling and very exciting war, making this rivalry the most intense ever in combat sports history. First we will get to know the fighters involved better. Israel Adesanya was born in Nigeria and moved to New Zealand with his family when he was a child. He fell in love with fighting from an early age. He made his debut in professional kickboxing in 2010, at the age of 20, having an impressive record of 75 wins and 5 losses in kickboxing. Later he decided to pursue a career in MMA. In 2018 he signed with the UFC. A year later Adesanya became the UFC middleweight champion. He had several title defenses and became one of the greatest fighters in the history of his division, and also one of the highest paid athletes in the history of MMA. Adesanya, just like every great fighter and every great champion, he also had his rival. His opponent is none other than Alex Pereira, aka Alex Poatan, the Brazilian Indian who became the kryptonite of the Nigerian's career. Alex comes from a very humble background, starting to work in a tire shop at the age of 12. At a very young age, he also helped his father as a bricklayer's assistant. Before he turned 18 he had discovered alcohol, and ended up becoming an alcoholic. In order to overcome this addiction he decided to start practicing martial arts. At the age of 21 he had his first kickboxing class. With little time in kickboxing he was already able to beat people who had been practicing this martial art for much longer than him, and it became clear that he was different and had the potential to go far. He decided to leave his life as an alcoholic behind and adopted the nickname Poatan, which means stone hands or hard hands in the Tupi-Guarani language. He adopted this nickname as a tribute to his indigenous roots. Just like Adesanya, Pereira was doing very well in kickboxing. Since they were competing in the same era, in the same weight division and in the same sport, it was only a matter of time until they finally face each other. On April 2, 2016, they fought for the first time. This fight took place in China. At the time both fighters were unknown, and the fight was not even on the main card. The first fight between them ended in a controversial way. The judges awarded Poatan the victory. Many fans, experts, and Adesanya himself disagree with the result of that fight to this day. Those involved in this fight didn't know it, but this was the beginning of the greatest rivalry in the history of combat sports. After controversially losing to Poatan, Adesanya entered one of the best phases of his kickboxing career, winning his next 7 fights in a row, until on January 20, 2017, he would fight for the Glory Belt, the kickboxing's biggest event in the world. His opponent would be the Dutch, Jason Wilnies, who was the first fighter to defeat and knock out Alex Pereira. In the fight between Adesanya and Wilnies for the Glory middleweight belt, the Nigerian fighter lost by unanimous decision. After failing to become champion in the biggest kickboxing event in the world, he was planning to switch entirely to MMA. At that time he already had 9 fights in professional MMA, and won all of them by knockout. He used to alternate between MMA and kickboxing. During most of his career he always gave more priority to kickboxing, but he wanted to make one of his dreams come true, which was to fight in the UFC, the biggest fighting event in the world. However, before going to MMA permanently he still had one more commitment in kickboxing world, which was a fight against Poatan in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Before the rematch between Israel and Alex in Brazil, Pereira was coming off a knockout defeat in his last fight against the Ukrainian, Artur Kishenko. At that moment both fighters were coming off a defeat. The first round started with both fighters low kicking each other. They both had good moments in the first round. In the second round the Nigerian was much better and almost got the knockout, but the Brazilian was saved by the count. At the beginning of the third round, Izzy, with a lot of confidence after dominating the previous round, started the third round with a flying knee. And a few seconds later he was brutally knocked out by Poatan. That was the first time he got knocked out in his career. This knockout was so bad that he needed an oxygen mask to recover. This defeat was catastrophic for Izzy, as it would be his last fight in the sport of kickboxing. Also that was very frustrating, since he was dominating the fight and ended up suffering one of the most brutal knockouts of the decade. That knockout would be very important for Alex's entry into the UFC, as this KO would serve as a passport for him to enter and be fast-tracked in the UFC. After that, they went their separate ways. Izzy arrived in the UFC in 2018 as one of the biggest prospects. With his charisma, he was slowly becoming one of the biggest stars in MMA. Israel made his UFC debut in February 2018, winning by knockout in the second round and getting the Performance of the Night award. In his second fight in the biggest MMA event in the world, he defeated Marvin Vettori by split decision. In his third fight he defeated Brad Tavares by unanimous decision. In November of that same year, he would have his fourth fight of the year. His opponent was the gatekeeper of the division, Derek Brunson, in a fight where Adesanya made Brunson look like an amateur, and knocked out the American wrestler in the first round. After this incredible performance, many saw him as a future middleweight champion, since in his first year in the UFC he had 4 fights and won them all. While Pereira, 7 months after his victory over Adesanya, he would fight for the glory belt against Canadian Simon Marcus. The fight took place on October 14, 2017, in China. Poatan won by unanimous decision and etched his name in the history of kickboxing, by becoming the champion of the biggest kickboxing event in the world. 2 months after becoming champion he would defend his belt for the first time against the Dutch, Yusri Belgaroui. Belgaroui had already defeated Pereira a few months before by decision. This fight would be the rematch between them. In the rematch Pereira knocked out Belgaroui in the third round. Alex was consolidating himself as a dominant champion, having defended Glory's middleweight belt 5 times in a row. Pereira saw that with each Adesanya victory, the Nigerian's popularity rose a lot. On some occasions Alex posted an image of Adesanya knocked out as a way of promoting himself. However, Izzy continued to ignore the Brazilian and didn't even mention Pereira's name.
You had a kickboxing fight. Was it in Glory?
Yeah, no, that was the one with in Brazil. With what's his name? Alex. Yeah.
Alex
that
Pereira,
one, yeah,
right?
Pereira, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you lost, and you were talking about what it was like to get knocked out.
Yeah, for me, that's everyone's worst fear. So that for me was 2 firsts for the first time.
Like you were real open about it on Instagram, and
because that's the fear. Like every fighter, like if it was just me and a guy fighting and I lost, it's like oh whatever. But when you put it in front of millions of people, that's the fear. It's like oh shit, I don't want to look like shit in front of all these people.
What did you get hit with?
I was southpaw. Was a left hook from him.
Interestingly, 2019 was a super important year for both of them. Izzy that year became UFC champion, while Poatan became the first double champion in the Glory kickboxing history. And it was that same year that they met for the first time since their last encounter in 2017. Adesanya was about to have his 5th fight in the UFC. His opponent would be his idol, Anderson Silva. The Spider was almost 44 years old and far from his prime. Knowing he was at a disadvantage, Silva decided to bring to his camp the last man to defeat Adesanya, the Glory champion, Alex Pereira. Adesanya beat Silva by unanimous decision in the fight that was awarded Fight of the Night. After this victory, Last Stylebender's next fight would be for the interim belt against Kelvin Gastelum. After 5 rounds of war, in one of the most exciting fights of the year, Izzy emerged victorious and defeated Gastelum by unanimous decision, becoming the new interim middleweight champion. He then faced Robert Whittaker in a title unification bout on October 2019, headlining UFC 243 for UFC Middleweight Championship. The main event of UFC 243 between Whittaker and Adesanya went down in history as the biggest crowd in UFC history, with 57,127 people in attendance at Marvel Stadium in Melbourne, Australia. After a knockdown in last second of the first round, Adesanya won the fight via knockout in the second round. This win earned him his 4th Performance of the Night award. He became the first fighter to defeat Whittaker in the UFC middleweight division. His popularity exploded after this win. He was slowly becoming one of the most well-known fighters in the world. In the following year in 2020 he defended the belt twice, once against Romero at the beginning of the year by unanimous decision, and another against Paulo Costa, when Izzy made Costa look like an amateur and easily knocked him out in the second round. He was undefeated in MMA, and the last time he lost was when he was competing in kickboxing, when he got brutally knocked out by Poatan. In 2020, Pereira's knockout over Izzy started to go viral on the internet. More people became aware of the existence of this fight, and wanted the Brazilian to arrive in the UFC to offer a different challenge to Izzy, who was gradually becoming one of the most dominant champions in the UFC. In addition to seeing the guy he had already defeated twice becoming an MMA star and one of the highest paid fighters in the UFC, what motivated Pereira a lot was this interview that the Nigerian gave in that exact same year of 2020.
At the end of the day, no one knows who the he is. When I'm world champion, when I'm a legend, he's gonna be at some pub talking some shit about I beat that guy one time.
Knowing that his popularity was increasing a lot with that KO, in 2020, the first double champion in Glory history, was also aiming to move to MMA. The previous year in 2019, Pereira had 3 title fights across 2 different divisions. He won all of them by knockout and became the first double champion in Glory history. At that moment he was already a kickboxing legend. Before focusing only on MMA, he had already fought in MMA 3 times. His MMA record at the time was 2 wins and 1 loss. In the second half of 2020 he signed with the LFA. Many fighters leave the LFA straight to the UFC. If Pereira had an outstanding performance in his LFA debut, the UFC could sign him right away. Prior to this fight, the last time he fought in MMA had been 4 years earlier in 2016, and after 4 years without fighting MMA, he would make his LFA debut on November 20th, 2020. In his debut he brutally knocked out his opponent in the first round. This victory made a noise in the fighting world. The UFC quickly hired him. The timing was the best possible, since Adesanya was running over everyone. Some contenders had even been defeated by the Nigerian more than once. At that time Alex already was a double champion in Glory kickboxing, being the middleweight champion and interim light heavyweight champion, since at the time the linear light heavyweight champion, the Russian Artem Bakadov, was injured and could not fight. Poatan was not satisfied in being linear champion of one division. He also wanted the linear light heavyweight belt, and in January 2021, he defeated Artem Bakadov and became the first fighter to be lineal champion of 2 different divisions in Glory. Before moving fully to UFC, he had one more commitment in kickboxing, which was the rematch against Bakadov in September of that same year for the Glory Light Heavyweight Championship. Pereira lost the rematch. Two months later he finally made his UFC debut at UFC 268, where he brutally knocked out his opponent in the second round, winning the Performance of the Night award. Knowing that Poatan had great potential to be a UFC star, the UFC promoted him a lot, as he is a kickboxing legend, has a very exciting fighting style to watch and has a history with Adesanya. 4 months after his debut in the biggest MMA event, he was expected to face the dangerous striker Bruno Silva, who had won 7 consecutive fights by knockout. Pereira defeated Silva by unanimous decision. For his third UFC fight he was expected to face Sean Strickland, who was undefeated fighting as a middleweight, and the current number 4 in the rankings at the time. The UFC intentionally placed the fight between Pereira and Strickland in the same card of Adesanya vs Cannonier main event at UFC 276. The winner of the fight between Pereira and Strickland would be the next challenger for the belt. Alex knocked out Strickland in the first round. In the post-fight interview, he grabbed Joe Rogan's microphone and asked everyone present in the arena to root for Adesanya to defend the belt against Cannonier, so that he and the Nigerian would face each other again, but this time in a different sport. This was a quick victory for the Brazilian fighter. He came out of the fight unharmed and left the locker room and went to watch the main fight between Izzy and Cannonier in the front row. In the main event, Adesanya dominated Cannonier and defended his middleweight belt for the 5th consecutive time. As he had already defeated almost everyone in the top 5 in the rankings, only Pereira was left with an unprecedented challenge to Izzy in the UFC. Later, Dana White announced that Israel Adesanya would try to defend his belt for the 6th time against his bogeyman, Alex Poatan, at UFC 281 on November 12, 2022. At the press conference leading up to the fight, Izzy highlighted that Alex only got to where he was because of him. Israel said that he had a more difficult and impressive path to the belt, while the Brazilian fighter had already got his title shot with just 3 fights in the UFC. They engaged in trash talk, in a somewhat limited way due to the language barrier, as Pereira doesn't speak English and Adesanya doesn't understand Portuguese.
Behind us is a whole army, and then behind us is a whole nation, is a whole spirit, is a whole mana, and you can't fuck with it. Trust me, you can't.
Você vai estar sozinho lá dentro do octógono.
I don't speak Portuguese.
You're gonna be alone inside that octagon without a team.
Oh yes, you and me, don't worry, but they're gonna be with me. They're gonna be with me in spirit. He's got bragging rights. Talk all the shit you want. Talk all the shit you want. Because trust me, they can't save you either when you're locked in there with me.
Ei, Adesanya, deixa eu te fazer uma pergunta. Você quer estar aqui realmente?
Caralho, I can't understand what this guy is saying, man.
Do you really want to be here?
I am here. I am here.
Despite having 2 wins over Israel, Poatan never underestimated or belittled Adesanya's skills, since in the first fight between them was a controversial decision, and in the second fight he was close to being knocked out in the second round, but this third fight between them was in a different sport. At the time, Adesanya had 24 fights in MMA, 23 wins, and 1 loss to Ian Blachowicz at light heavyweight. As a middleweight, Izzy was still undefeated, while Alex had only 7 fights in mixed martial arts, 6 wins and 1 loss. Poatan had less experience, but he had the emotional advantage, as he was the only man to knock out the Nigerian fighter. Combining boxing, kickboxing, and MMA, Izzy already had more than 100 professional fights. In those more than 100 fights, only 1 individual managed to knock him out, and that was exactly Alex Pereira. 5 years after suffering one of the most devastating knockouts in the history of kickboxing, Adesanya would finally have the chance to get revenge. This fight had a huge weight on him, because if he lost the fight, he would leave the throne, and the one to occupy the throne would be exactly his biggest rival, and for him that would be a nightmare coming true. 6 years later, a fight that had only served to fill a kickboxing preliminary card in China. Now it's the main event of the biggest fight organization in the world. The trilogy has already started on fire, with the Brazilian throwing a flying kick that lands in the void. The first round was balanced, with both fighters throwing heavy blows at each other. In the final seconds of the first round, Izzy came very close to knocking out Poatan, but the Brazilian was saved by the bell. In the second round, Izzy was more confident, while Alex was trying to surround Adesanya in the fence, but was not successful. In this round, Poatan connected the best blows and even converted a takedown. The fight was 1-1 on the scorecards. The third round began with kicks exchanges. The Brazilian was doing better in the stand-up fight. But for the first time in his UFC career, Adesanya landed a takedown, where he dominated the Brazilian on the ground with strong ground and pound strikes. The champion won the third round. In the fourth round, Pereira appeared to be more worn out and tired. The Nigerian won that round too. Alex urgently needed the knockout. That's when former light heavyweight champion Glover Teixeira gave the following speech to Pereira.
5 minutos pra você ser campeão mundial, Poatan. 5 minutos, Poatan. Tem que chegar, tem que chegar, tem que pegar. Tem que nocautear, ele é o campeão. Tem que nocautear, vambora. É o último, vai ser campeão do mundo, vai ser campeão do mundo. Vambora. Busca lá dentro. Busca lá dentro.
His signature left hook, the same blow that led to Izzy being knocked out 5 years earlier connected, Izzy was in trouble. He loses balance and the Brazilian doesn't stop going forward. Adesanya can no longer defend himself and the referee steps in to stop the fight, making his nightmare coming true, losing for his bogeyman for the third time in a different sport. Despite the bad outcome, Izzy seemed to be in good spirits. He attended the post-fight press conference. He commented that he believed he would finish the Brazilian in the third or fourth round, and praised Pereira's durability and ability to recover. Most fighters, when they lose a title fight, they don't go to the post-fight press conference. Izzy showed he was different by attending the post-fight press conference. Despite taking the loss like a champion, he highlighted that the war wasn't over yet. Poatan, on the other hand, had just become the middleweight champion. With little time of full dedication to MMA, he had already become the UFC champion. In his fourth fight in the UFC, he had won the belt. He was little by little becoming one of the most beloved fighters by the public. For his first title defense, he would face Adesanya again. Since the last stylebender was the dominant champion, he had the right to an immediate rematch. The fourth fight between them was expected to take place at UFC 287 on April 8, 2023, in Miami, Florida, United States. This fight would be a title defense for Alex. For Adesanya, on the other hand, this fight was all or nothing, because if he loses to his biggest rival for the fourth time, he would leave the middleweight reign and could never fight for the belt again. There was enormous pressure on him. He needed to be mentally sound. A few months before the fight, he got a tattoo on his face. His tattoo is Arabic lettering that translates to dragon. He stated that the meaning of this tattoo is that the old version of you needs to die for a newer one to emerge. On Instagram, he posted a video with 3 arrows in his skin, representing his 3 losses to Pereira, saying it was hunting season and the game is not over. And Israel promised that he would return all the arrows in this fight, every one of them. Pereira said the last arrow would land on Izzy's chest. Poatan never underestimated Izzy. Even with 3 wins over his rival, he knew that in the last 2 fights before he scored the knockout, he was losing the fight, and he rewatched the fight between them in the UFC countless times. He also revealed that in his last fight against Izzy, he had a finger injury, and that injury hindered his performance a little. Now, without the injury, everything indicates that this fight would go his way again. The fourth fight between them starts with a lot of study and kick exchanges. In this round, Poatan was trying his best to hinder or limit Adesanya's movement with several low kicks. The first round was even. In the second round, Poatan lands a high kick that makes the Nigerian retreat. Poatan goes up and tries to put Izzy against the fence. Adesanya gets away from the fence and manages to hit good combinations on Pereira, until one of Alex's devastating low kicks hits Izzy and makes the Nigerian limp. Poatan goes all out. It seemed like it was just a matter of time until he knocks out Izzy again. Izzy then comes out of the shell and hits Poatan with the same combo of blows that almost knocked out the Brazilian in the previous fight, but this time there was no bell or count to save Pereira, and Adesanya got one of the most incredible knockouts in the history of MMA. He returned the arrows just as promised. This was without a doubt the biggest victory of Izzy's career. He finally avenged his biggest rival, regained his belt and kicked Alex out of the middleweight division with a brutal knockout, and this knockout was chosen by the main website specializing in MMA as the knockout of the year. After this defeat, Pereira moved up to light heavyweight, where he became the second Brazilian athlete to be a double champion in UFC, alongside his compatriot, Amanda Nunes. As soon as he became the newest double champion in the UFC, he challenged Adesanya to another fight. The Nigerian mocked Pereira's call out, and so far he has shown no interest in fighting the Brazilian again.
I wish he spoke English. I wish he spoke English.
Hey, Adesanya, come to
was being wholesome.
And maybe there's another chapter for this rivalry.